President's Lecture Series and the Philosophy Forum. This afternoon, it's my pleasure to welcome Alexander Nehamas. He is the Edward N. Carpenter II, class of 1943, professor of humanities, philosophy, and comparative literature. And all this tells you about the depth and breadth, and above all, the grace that Professor Nehamas brings to philosophy. You will get a full account of his accomplishments when my colleague Matt Stroll will introduce him this evening at 8 o'clock in the University Theater, when Professor Nehamas will talk about Because It Was He, Because It Was I, the Good of Friendship. His topic this afternoon is friendship and other non-moral values. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nehamas.
Thanks very much for this introduction. Thank you all for coming. I must admit that I didn't realize that I was to talk for up to 40 minutes. I thought when they said seminar, they meant seminar. So I have prepared some things that I'd like to talk about, but I hope to open the floor soon to discussion, questions. Of course, I know that whenever I go to class and I say, I won't keep you long, I always go over the period. So stop me if I do, please. One likes the sound of one's voice, especially if one is an academic. So let me give you some background about why I'm interested in friendship in particular, and then, start with, sort of go into it in some more detail. I have been very interested in ancient Greek philosophical thought for many years, and one of the issues that has struck me, especially when one reads Aristotle, who in a very serious way in his Nicomachean Ethics gives us one of the prototypes of what an ethical treatise or a treatise on moral philosophy is supposed to be. One of the most interesting things about it is that the circle of people that is salient, ethically or morally speaking, to Aristotle and to the Greeks more generally, ends by and large at the walls of the city. People in the next city over there, they are potential enemies. They are not anything like our conception of the human being today that presupposes or envisages a common ground between all of us that can be the basis for sort of impartial and equal treatment. For the Greeks, apart from the barbarians, of course, they do recognize a big distinction between Greeks and barbarians. And of course, that wasn't necessarily a bad word, right? And barbarian, just supposedly when non-Greeks spoke, they sounded like bar, 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 and that became barbarian for the Greeks. Just the sound of a foreign language, supposedly. But even for other Greeks, you didn't have the kind of obligations or duties, nor, of course, did they have the concomitant rights or whatever. And even within the city itself, there was no sense that everyone should be treated equally. There was a kind of political equality in Athens in particular, but political equality in a town, in a city that may have had as many as 250,000 people altogether or more, political equality was given only to about 30,000 males born in Athens. They were the citizens. They were the ones that were equal to one another vis-a-vis the law. From then on, there are all kinds of different ways in which you treated different people. And in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, in the two books of the Nicomachean Ethics that we wrongly consider as his discussion of friendship, the word that he uses in Greek, the Greek word he uses is the word philia, which I think means something much, much more broad than friendship. Aristotle makes it very clear that how you treat people depends not really on their being human beings, so to speak, which is our sense of how we treat people morally. We treat them as human beings. You treat people depending on their value, on their abilities. So, for example, if you have two people who, as he says, are unequal in virtue, the more virtuous one should get more of whatever it is that you have than the less virtuous. There is no sense, in other words, of some kind of human equality. By contrast, in modernity, especially after the Renaissance, and especially again with the the establishment of the market in the 18th century and the Enlightenment also in the 18th century, a new conception, a new foundation for interpersonal and interpersonal relationships begins. Namely, the idea that human beings are all essentially the same kind of thing. So the Greek barbarian or the European, non-European distinctions are not supposed to be real distinctions anymore. Now, in practice, of course, things are much, much more complicated than that. I'm only talking about the philosophical, ideological, so to speak, position. And Immanuel Kant, of course, a great German philosopher in the Enlightenment, is the one who articulated this view most clearly and more clearly than anyone else. Morality, as far as Kant is concerned, is based on the categorical imperative, on the idea that whatever you do should be an instance of a maxim that could be universalized, that everyone should be able to apply. So you never treat people in a way that implies differences between the way you treat one person rather than another. Once that became the foundation for moral thinking, and of course the background of that, of course, comes from Christianity, where the idea that all human beings are children of God, and therefore brethren, brothers and sisters, and therefore everyone should be loved equally. Once you have a view like that, then something like friendship becomes very problematic. Because friendship essentially involves differential treatment of people. The whole point about my friends is that I treat them differently from the way I treat others. I give them more of myself, I help them more than I help other people, I expect more from them than I expect from other people, and so on and so forth. How can you reconcile this kind of differential treatment with the impartial treatment that morality enjoins us? That has been a major problem in modern philosophical thought. Big enough, I think, to account for the fact that after the Renaissance, there's almost no discussion of friendship in philosophy. Whereas in classical Greece, in Rome, in some medieval thought, it is an extraordinarily important topic. It just more or less disappears. Nevertheless, almost the whole philosophical tradition that we have, and I'll talk about this more tonight, seems to accept certain fundamental principles that are found in the Aristotelian ethics. And those are fundamentally two. One is that friendship is ultimately a moral good. In other words, moral people are the ones who can be friends, and having a friend and being a friend makes us morally better. That's the one principle. And the second is that there are three kinds of friendship. And Aristotle distinguishes as follows. We can be friends because, Aristotle says, I am attracted and I admire your virtue. So we can be friends because I admire your virtue, or at least we have philia. Let me not beg the questions. We have philia because I can admire your virtue, or we can have philia because of the pleasure that our relationship gives me, or we can have philia because of the pleasure the relationship gives us. It has to be mutual, or because of the advantage that our friendship, our philia, gives us both. What's interesting to me is that almost every discussion of friendship in later philosophy repeats this tripartite division on the one hand, and the idea that ultimately this friendship, this philia, this friendship is the best kind, the only genuine kind, and that it makes it a moral good. Makes friendship a moral good. To me, that sounds completely at odds with ordinary experience. I don't think, I can't see how we can think that friendship is essentially a good of morality. One of the examples that I'll use tonight is the film Thelma and Louise, which some of you may know. It's about two women who have a pretty dismal life and who engage in a lot of adventures through which they do all kinds of terrible things. And by doing those terrible things, they become admirable. Not just they did bad things in their friends, but their friendship thrives on their doing those terrible things like murder and theft and burglary and all kinds of other terrible things. And at the end, they're admirable people. At the same time, if we think of friendship as a moral good, we have a very serious problem, and contemporary philosophy has worked very hard at it to show how friendship, which is differential and partial, as I was saying before, could possibly be consistent with the impartiality of morality. So 90% of the stuff that you see in the philosophical journals and books today about friendship concern how do we make it compatible with morality. Well, what I ended up thinking is that we have overstated the importance of morality among human values. My colleague Harry Frankfurt at Princeton calls this attitude pan-moralism. It's the idea that all our values, everything that is of value to us, is ultimately either a moral or a political value. Namely, again, values that depend on impartiality and equality. But as a matter of fact, my sense is, though I agree those are important and crucial values and extraordinarily sort of significant in ordinary life, they're only one side of the point, the one side of the picture. There's a whole other range of values that have not been discussed enough and we don't take seriously enough when we think about what counts in life and what makes life worthwhile. That may be a wrong thing to say at this point, but I will say it anyway. I call those values aesthetic, which makes many people think that they're superficial and, you know, that I'm sort of an Oscar Wilde type and that I dress in purple clothes with green carnations. No, that's not the point. The reason that I call them aesthetic is that we observe them most clearly in our relations to the arts and to beauty in general. And let me tell you how that works for a moment. Why do we admire particular works of art? Why do we admire the Divine Comedy or Rembrandt's self-portraits or Bach's B minor Mass or whatever it is that you like? It doesn't matter to me. And here, Professor Borgman and I may have disagreements. What if you like St. Elsewhere, the greatest daytime drama ever presented on television? Declared to be such by TV Guide, no less an authority than TV Guide itself. It doesn't, as I said, it doesn't matter to me what it is that you like, as long as you like something. Why do you like it? What is it that attracts you to it? Well, I have two things to say about it. First is that you won't be able to tell me when I ask you, and I'll come back to that. And the second is, it does something that nothing else does. Your favorite work accomplishes something, has some feature, some accomplishment, some characteristics. It gives you a kind of pleasure that nothing else does. In other words, you like it to the extent that you do, and I don't think that explains anything, but at least gives us a pointer. You like it because of its differences from everything else. It stands out. The B minor Mass does things to music that other pieces, even other great pieces, can't possibly do. Proust's novel, In Search of Lost Time, accomplishes something that no other novel can do. And of course, each great novel accomplishes something that other novels can't do. But what it is, again, we admire those works and we admire their creators for their distinction, for their difference from everything else. And my sense is that when we call something beautiful, when we find something beautiful, it's always something that stands out and makes the rest of its context become simply background. Okay? These values that are so clear in art, I think, are also the values that appear in the family of situations that we characterize by the term love. I think whenever we love a person, and I think the same thing is, the same attitude is the attitude that we have towards works of art. We love the pieces the works that we are close to, we love them. That's the only way to express our relationship or an attitude to them. The people we love are people whom we see, in whom we see something we can't see in anyone else. The proverbial philosophical example, right, is that you enter a party, you go to a party, and a face at the other end of the room just hits you and you're speechless or whatever. Well, in a way, that's exactly what I mean. One person here, one set of features, stands out from the rest of its context, and the rest of the context becomes background. The same thing, I think, has to do with the same sort of attitude is involved in friendship. Our friends are people in whom we see aspects which we can't see in anyone else, aspects that we admire that we can't see in anyone else. These values, I think, are aesthetic, and as I said, I call them aesthetic. I call them aesthetic because of the connection with the arts. But how they are, so to speak, translated into everyday life has to do with the fact that as a matter of everyday experience, we admire people who do things their own way. This is something that we need to take into account when we think about what it is that makes life worthwhile. It's not only being a good, morally good person that counts. It also is important to be original, to have new ideas, to do things your own way, to have a style of your own, a style that suggests that what you have accomplished is your own work rather than the imitation of someone else. And that again is connected with the arts, where the effort to create something original and important is absolutely essential to our understanding and appreciation of works, of particular works, or of the arts in general. We are afraid, I think, that if we accentuate and underline these particular values, we will undermine morality as a whole. And I don't want to deny that there is a danger here. The most trivial example, we were talking about it last night with a group of you here, is an example that comes from the philosopher Bernard Williams, who talks about the painter Gauguin. In the late 19th century, Gauguin gives up his family, his wife and his 2 children, leaves them just as they are without caring whether how they're going to feed themselves or live, and sails to Tahiti, where he will try to become a great painter. And as a matter of fact, he succeeds. Now, Williams's point is that if he hadn't succeeded, right, if he'd gone to Tahiti and just never made any of the paintings that he did, if we knew him at all, we'd say, what a terrible person to leave his wife and child for no reason whatsoever. But as a matter of fact, he did succeed. He did make the great paintings. And in some disturbing way, that makes his abandoning his wife and children less salient to our evaluation. It doesn't make it good. It's a bad thing that he did. But how would you rather have it? Would you rather have it that he'd stayed with a family and not made the paintings? Or that he'd left the family and did make the paintings that we have? Here is a case where aesthetics and ethics, or aesthetics and morality, come into conflict. Now, there are many people who think that whenever there is a conflict like that, the moral element has to win out, needs to trump the other elements, whatever they are. I'm not convinced about that. I'm not saying that the aesthetic should always trump the ethical or the moral again. I'm saying it's an issue that needs to be decided case by case, and there are no clear criteria for telling us that's the way to go. In other words, there's no general method that I can imagine that will tell us when there's a conflict between the moral aspects of a particular action or a particular creation or a particular situation. If there's a conflict between its moral aspects and its other aspects, the moral aspects should always overcome the non-moral aspects. And that is something that I think people find very sort of disturbing. And I find it disturbing myself, because I find myself very often admiring people who I don't think are always particularly moral. And I think we all do that, but we also have a mechanism for justifying to ourselves. The mechanism comes from, in a way, Nietzsche has described it, the philosopher Nietzsche has described it, I think, better than anyone else. He says, maybe great individuals have their virtues too, he says. Maybe they do. But the point is that once they have accomplished what they have accomplished, whatever it is, we take all their features and reinterpret them as virtues. You see. So we end up thinking that our heroes are all virtuous people. Whereas in fact, they became virtuous because they managed to establish their values as values that we actually accept. And that is, as I said, that is a very discomforting sort of attitude to have, because it suggests that there are, again, no clear criteria for saying, take Napoleon, right? And Napoleon is one of the great individuals in the world. Every time we look at the map of Europe, we're seeing Napoleon's, what Nietzsche would call Napoleon's will to power. The map of Europe reflects what Napoleon did in Europe 200 years ago, whatever it was. A great man. A good man? Why do I admire him? We admire him because he was such a great general, because he had such incredible ambition, because of the way that he sort of rethought the way that wars are to be fought, and his spreading of the message of the French Revolution, and so on and so forth. Of course, if you're English at the time that this was happening, Napoleon is just a Corsican peasant who declares himself emperor and thinks he can actually talk to the king on a one-to-one basis. He's a horrible little man. And if he hadn't won his first battles in Italy and in Egypt and all that, if we knew him at all, he would have been a horrible little man. And as I said, probably we didn't know who he was. But once he has accomplished what he has accomplished, once he has established himself as a great person, either we reinterpret his features, all of them as virtues, or his vices become, in a very peculiar way, irrelevant. And that's something that we need to think about very seriously. Audie Murphy, right, was a great hero of the Second World War, the youngest person in American history to have the Congressional Medal of Honor or something like that. I don't know how many people he killed, right? Probably as many as Sergeant York killed in that famous Gary Cooper movie. We know he is a hero because of that. We know very little about what kind of person he was, whether his motives were the right motives for what he did, whether, it was luck that caused him to be where he was at the time that he was there. Things just drop out, and we admire him. The attitude that is appropriate to the aesthetic side of value is admiration, whereas the attitude to morality, appropriate to morality, is not admiration but respect. Those are very, very different. But we admire the works of art we are impressed by. We admire people who are accomplishing the sort of thing that works of art accomplish, namely to do things in a different way and to show us that we can live in a slightly different way from the way we've lived before. And also we admire our friends. But admiration, as I said, is an ambiguous attitude, an ambivalent attitude, because, as I said, it can be addressed to individuals who can be extremely dangerous and sometimes even vicious. Either in literature or the arts, where we have all kinds of elegant torturers and educated killers and so on and so forth, but also in real life as well. Two elements, and I'll repeat that now. One is that we reinterpret the features of our heroes or the great individuals that we admire into good features, morally speaking, or we disregard them. And that is what causes a lot of difficulty. There's another difficulty that concerns what I call aesthetic values, and that's the following. And again, I'll talk about that again tonight, later on. Have you ever tried to tell somebody why you love them? I'm sure some of us have. Can you remember how terribly banal you were? I love you because you're sensitive and intelligent and cute and rich. Now that doesn't count, huh? It's interesting, why not? Interesting. We can't say why we love people. Similarly, I think you can't say why you find either a person or a work of art beautiful. I can never tell you enough about why I adore Proust or Thomas Mann or Mozart or St. Elsewhere. I can never tell you enough to allow you to agree with me that the composer or the author or the work is a good work of art or not. You have to do it by yourself. You can hear me, but you can't make the judgment as your own judgment. You can accept my judgment and say, I believe Nehamas is such a good critic that I'll take everything he says and believe it. But that doesn't mean that it's your own judgment. You can only make your own judgment by exposing yourself directly to the work of art in question. Nothing that I tell you is enough to communicate what this, my attitude itself. I can tell you what it is, but you can't share it on the basis of what I tell you. There's always a gap between the last thing I say about what I find beautiful and the finding beautiful, my finding it beautiful. I can't even explain to myself. This is not a matter of the inadequacies of language. This is a matter of something else altogether. Again, Nietzsche says that at the gates of our ignorance, we place a word as a god. And I think in this case, the word that we place as a god of this ignorance is the self, yourself, or in itself. I love you for yourself. I love the person. I don't love your features. I love you as a person. It's you. What is it to love a work of art? It's to love it for its own sake, whatever that means. Lots of argument has been directed at trying to decide what exactly it is that this for yourself or for its own sake, in itself, means in this context. And lots of metaphysics about what the self is has gone into it. My own view is the following. When I say of something that it's beautiful, and I believe that everything that we find beautiful is something we love, and conversely, everything that we love is something we find beautiful. It's impossible, I believe, to love something or someone which a thing that we actually find ugly. I think it's impossible to do that, whether it's a person or a work of art. So whenever we say, or no, it's not a saying, whenever we find something beautiful, and we say, look, this is a great work of art because, it has this and has that feature, and so it's a great work of art, or it's beautiful, whatever. We generally think that to pronounce the judgment, it's beautiful, is the end of our interaction with the work. So we look at the work or the person, we see what features it has, and then we conclude that it's beautiful. I think that's not at all how the aesthetic judgment, the judgment this is beautiful, works. Imagine again going into the proverbial party and seeing this fantastic face staring at you, or not staring at you, from the other end of the room. What is it that you want to do at that point? So you think it's beautiful. You find it strikes you. Well, of course, one thing that you want to see is keep looking, right? But that's not the only thing. You want to approach. You want to get to know the person in question. The same token, you want to get to know the work of art that you find attractive. One way of putting it, which may be a little highfalutin, but nevertheless, that's the best I found, is you want to make it part of your life. And you think, or you hope, or you suspect that if that object becomes part of your life, and if you become part of its life, your life will be better in some way or other. You don't know in which way it will become better, right? But that's what we feel, that if only that person sort of reacts to me the way I'm reacting to them, I will be happier than I am now. And that's why I sort of, for my book on beauty, I use Stendhal's definition of beauty, namely only a promise of happiness. A beautiful thing promises us something in the future. And the feeling, love in other words, that we have for what we find beautiful is a feeling that always involves a commitment to the future. But as I said, we don't know exactly what it is that they will do for us, right? And if we don't know what that is, then of course we can't say it, right? That is the part that is always missing out from our explanations of why something is beautiful, or why we love it, or why we admire it, or whatever. What's left out is what we don't know. namely that which we hope or expect or assume or hypothesize, whatever the word is, that this object or person will do for us in the long run. Now, because we don't know what it is, on the one hand, we can't say it. On the other hand, it becomes a very dangerous thing, because it could be that what it does for us in the end is really bad. There's no way we can be wrong about this person or work doing good things for us. And there are two different ways in which it can do us harm. One way is if the promise that it makes us, so that we think it makes us, doesn't get fulfilled, right? It just turns out to be uninteresting. It turns out not to have anything to offer us. It turns out to be to make you feel the way that Proust's character Swann feels about Odette, this woman that he pursued for years and years and years, and finally marries a woman who caused him untold nights of unhappiness. And finally, after he marries her one day, he says, "Yeah, to think that I wasted the best years of my life, that I pined and cried for a woman who wasn't even my type." Nothing there. It could also hurt you by actually doing bad things to you, not just leaving you indifferent. So there are three ways. The most dangerous way, I think, is when it does hurt you. It does harm you. But as it harms you, it not only does bad things to you directly, it undermines your standards of what is good and what isn't good, so that you can think that you're happy. But the standards that lead you to think that you're happy because of your interaction with this object or person are degraded standards. Let me give you an example. Here I'll come back to issues between us. I came to this country when I was 18 years old from Greece, and we had no television. So I came here, went to a very intellectual college where, people didn't watch television except maybe the monster movie at 11:30 on Saturday night, which was campy, so we could do that without having to excuse ourselves. So I thought that people who watched television, generally speaking, were fat, wore flannel shirts, had pimples, bad hair, the couches, the stuffing was coming out, they drank Pabst beer, and they watched 8 hours and 32 minutes of television a day. Did you recognize someone? Now, many years later, I was writing a book. I was on leave, I was writing a book, and I was exhausted by the end of the night. I was subletting an apartment, somebody else's, and they had a color television set, which I'd never really been exposed to. So at night, I would turn it on, and after a while, I started liking it. And I started watching more, and there was WKRP in Cincinnati, and Hill Street Blues, and all those old, sent elsewhere. And one day I said, look, if I don't do something with this, I will have wasted a very large part of my life. So I started thinking about television. And not only did I watch more, I started writing about it. And I wrote things that I think are some of the best things I've ever written. For example, I figured out, nobody believes me, but there it is, that Plato's famous proscription of poetry from his ideal state, it's a shocking end of Plato's Republic when he says in our state we'll have no drama and no poetry except for a very, very small part. He gets rid of Homer and Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and Pindar and all the great poets of antiquity. It's not that Plato doesn't understand poetry. It's that he is not looking at it as art in the way that we see it. He looks at it as what it was at the time, namely popular entertainment. And the arguments he gives against tragic poetry and epic poetry are three. And here they are. One, it conflates and confuses the authentic and the fake. Second, it can only represent violent and sexual subjects. And third, it causes even the best among us to act in ways that we would be ashamed to act otherwise if it hadn't been exposed to it. Now, that is not a set of arguments that are specific to tragedy. It's a set of arguments that are specific to a sort of generic and can apply to any state of popular culture, and they have been applied again and again and again in the history of popular culture. The Christians didn't like the circus, the Roman circus, and they had reasons very much like this. The Puritans hated Shakespeare because of exactly, there's a wonderful book, wonderful, I don't know, called History of Mastics. It has 1,000 arguments against Shakespeare. And so only ruffians and whores and this and that go to the plays. It's the worst possible thing. Coleridge despises the novel because he compares it to Shakespeare and says wherever the reading of novels prevails, the human mind is destroyed. I won't even call them, he says, pastime, they're kill time. It's exactly, of course, the same argument that's been made about photography and about film and about jazz and about television, and is now being made about video games and internet, and will be made, I think, as long as the sun is still functioning. So I had this terrific insight, right? My friend John Cooper thinks I'm insane. I actually did a lot of harm to myself by getting interested in that stuff, and the television actually destroyed my mind. Now, I think he's wrong. I think I'm doing fine, thank you very much. But I'm doing that, I'm thinking that because my standards have changed. The standards I had before told me watching television is terrible and only stupid and ugly people do it. Now my standards tell me I was a stupid snob back then. How to decide? Right? If you have that kind of distance from yourself a little bit, say, it's not clear how one decides whether my love for television has harmed me or done me good. And that's a danger that all of us run, whether it's Shakespeare or video games. I believe that ultimately what really counts is not the quality itself of the object that you are attracted to, but what it is that you do with it, and what it is that you end up being as a result of your interaction with it. And that is precisely why your aesthetic judgments, and here's another way in which they differ radically from moral judgments, are not universal. Imagine, when I say of something that it's beautiful, of course I don't say it just for myself. If it's just for myself, I say I like it or it pleases me or something like that. If I say it's beautiful, it's something that I want others to agree with. It's something that I want to argue about. So I will do so. Matt Stroll and I were talking yesterday. I mean, when we like something, both of us have the same tendency. We want to talk to our friends about it. I saw a great film, I want to tell you about it. I read a great book, I want to tell you about it. But I don't want to tell everyone about it. And in fact, I don't care if there are many, 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 many people in the world who have no idea of that object and who even, if they do have an idea of it, don't like it. In other words, there is no such thing as wanting everyone to agree on an aesthetic judgment. Exactly in contrast to what we think about morality. If it's the right thing to do to sort of grant a certain set of rights to human beings, then everyone should agree with it. And if somebody doesn't, either they're wrong or we are wrong, and we have to try to figure out. But suppose that, say, a Chinese person from, I don't know, Chengdu in Sichuan doesn't like Rembrandt because he's never heard of Rembrandt. Is it absolutely necessary for me to convince them to like Rembrandt? Is that going to be a good thing for them? Well, think that in order to like Rembrandt, it's not enough just to show the person the pictures, right, and say, oh, you know, they're great pictures. They have to learn a lot of things about Western painting and the history of art and the history of literature and all this sort of thing. They need to be, so to speak, acculturated to Western culture. And that's not at all clear to me that that's something that is necessarily good for that person, that will improve their life. So very often, though I admire something intensely, though I think it's beautiful, I think that in principle it would be wonderful if some, at least, people agreed with me. I do not want everyone to agree with me. In fact, to me, the idea that everyone would agree with an aesthetic judgment of mine is as repulsive as the idea that someone else might agree with every aesthetic judgment of mine. Think about that. Because, and why is that? It's because our aesthetic judgments, namely our attitudes, our love attitudes, if I can, that's a terrible word, isn't it? Love attitudes. No, I scratch that. I didn't say it. Our loves are essential to making ourselves individuals, to differentiate us from other people. The things that I like in life, the things that I love, as they are put together, are crucially part of my character. They're crucially features that, because they're always different from something that somebody else loves, distinguish me from other people. And if I am lucky and talented enough to put them together in an interesting, attractive way, they themselves might become objects that someone else might end up loving. Do you see what I mean, in other words? That our aesthetic judgments implicate our whole character, and character, my character versus your character, is what distinguishes each individual from every other in the world. And distinction in this sense is absolutely crucial to what counts as a good life. And that part of the good life, I don't think it has been forgotten in everyday practice. We're constantly depending on values of that sort to judge people, to admire people, to justify or condemn our own lives or not. But I think they have been forgotten in our theoretical approaches, in our philosophy, which has limited itself to moral, universal, and impartial values, and has abandoned this other side, which, as I said, has been, so to speak, condemned as superficial, irresponsible, aesthete, something that serious people don't really care about. And part of that, of course, has to do with the fact that contemporary American philosophy, analytical American philosophy, has taken its paradigms from the sciences and mathematics. I mean, the cynical way of looking at philosophy that I have every now and then is to say that there are two kinds of philosophers: failed scientists, mathematicians, or failed artists and critics. So it depends. Well, most of the people who are in philosophy today are, on the cynical view, failed scientists and mathematicians. And what they admire is mathematics and science. I'm a failed artist and critic, so what I admire is the arts and things like that. There is this bias in our philosophy today. There's no question about it, and it has become a very theoretical discipline, a discipline which people are proud to admit has no implication about their everyday life. There was a student at Princeton last year visiting who made a short film about philosophy, and at one point he has two of my colleagues, and I mean, he's interviewing us separately, two of my colleagues and me, and he's asking, what does a philosophy have to do with your personal life? And the first one says, nothing whatsoever. The second says, nothing whatsoever. Maybe my personal life has influenced my philosophy, but certainly not the other one. And then I come and say, you can't really be a philosopher if your philosophy doesn't affect your personal life. These are very, very different views of how philosophy is to sort of relate itself to the broader culture in general. We have, as I say, theoretically speaking, on a theoretical level, we have forgotten the importance of those non-moral values. And that's something that I would like philosophy to be able to address again. There's a whole line of philosophers who are, in my view, bona fide philosophers whom we don't study. Montaigne, among modern philosophers, is one like that. He's only read by people in French departments. We never read him in philosophy. Pascal, we never read in philosophy. Nietzsche has now, we have begun reading Nietzsche, but he's still in a peculiar situation. Kierkegaard, as Paul Minch can tell you, is not the central figure of contemporary philosophy, but we'll make him, yeah, right? Wittgenstein, in certain ways, is somebody like that. There are some philosophers who are not in that way directly theoretical. They are not interested in philosophy so much in order to solve independent particular problems. They are interested in philosophy because in a Socratic mode, they want to ask, how should life be lived? And they have a certain approach, an approach toward philosophy that is actually difficult for the other side to understand and appreciate. All of them are people who write in a very distinct and very extraordinary literary style. Right. Take a page of Montaigne and a page of Kant, and you'll know what I mean. I mean, not that Kant doesn't have a style, he does have a style, but it's terrible. You see. Everybody has a style. The question is whether it's original, interesting, attractive, or boring and an imitation of someone else's. I mean, that's, or bad, period. So philosophers who have a literary style, why do they write in that way? They write in that way partly because they are trying to show something that is specific to them. They try to show us that there's a way of living life that is characteristic of their own approach. That's their approach to life that they're trying to tell us about, as opposed to the theoretical approach to philosophy that, because it addresses problems and only problems, tries to efface itself by having as uniform a style as possible so that the emphasis is on the problem and not on the solver, which I think is the right thing to do if you're solving problems. But if you're not solving problems, and if you're trying to say, here's my view of how life should be lived, now do what you want with it, you need to remind the other person that you're not giving them, so to speak, a solution. You're stating the problem that they have to answer. Nietzsche, again, is wonderful on this. He has a little dialogue in a book of his, The Gay Science, where A says to B, what, you want no imitators? And B says, I want everyone to fashion their own example, as I do. So I'll stop here and hope to have a discussion, if you don't mind. Thank you. I spoke longer than I thought, of course. Can I do? Yes.
Many of your comments could be taken to contradict your argument that friendship is a non-moral good.
Ooh, I hope not.
Well, if we have to ask ourselves whether we are wasting our time in a friendship, then aren't we asking ourselves a moral question?
Why?
What is more moral than the question of how we spend our lives?
I've defined morality in a particular way. No, I think the question, how do you spend your life or how life should be lived, is not a moral question. I would call it an ethical question, and morality is only one species of the ethical. Morality has to do with what I was saying, as I defined it, as an attitude that involves impartiality and universality, right? So the answer to how should I live my life could be selfishly and without any respect for other people. That could be an answer to that question. And it's not a moral answer at all. Or you could say, you can give any kind of answer to it. One of those answers could be a moral answer, namely, I'll try to live my life as a virtuous person, where virtue means moral virtue. But that's all. I think what you're doing, in other words, is you're using a very broad sense of morality. And I think you're right in that broad sense, how to live one's life is a moral question. If by morality we mean anything that has to do with the quality of life. But that's precisely what I want to deny, right?
Why are you so intent on denying the broad sense of morality?
I'm not denying the broad sense of morality. I'm denying that morality is the only species, that moral values are the only species of values there are. And I can give you the easy answer. I am intent on denying it because it's false.
So you're using a narrow conception of moral values.
Yes. I've defined it.
Rather than actually using a broad sense of moral values.
Yes. That's right. But I've given you a content for what I mean by morality. And I think it's a content that actually reflects philosophical practice.
Certainly it doesn't reflect the practice of Humeans.
Ah, Hume. Yes, I've heard about him. Hume. Well, he seems to come into everything, Hume, somehow. But I really don't want to talk about him.
That's very strange.
Yeah, because
So you're advertising an incompleteness in your understanding.
no, I don't. I'm not advertising incompleteness. I'm advertising my unwillingness to engage in that discussion with you. That's different.
Thank you.
Yeah. Ma'am, did you want to say something, please?
Well, it was somewhat addressed.
Okay, by all means.
I was thinking of Rilke's poem about the gazing at the archaic torso.
You must change your life.
And
Wonderful, yeah.
thinking of how one could address that in a moral way or in an ethical, specifically ethical way. And that when you respond wholeheartedly to something, whether it's a person or an object, it seems to me it always calls you into question.
I think I agree with you, except that wholeheartedly, because we're not defining it, may be a little too vague, but I think you're absolutely right. That there's a kind of, at least for a while, a total commitment to another thing. Where the other thing, whether it's a person or an object, its needs and its desires and its nature become something that I want to allow to affect me. In other words, I don't take myself for granted. I don't take myself for granted when I have this attitude towards another person or another object. I say, again, I'll talk about this a bit tonight, but they're instrumental relationships. Things that I have, say, with the waiter at the restaurant. Well, I know already what I want, and whether the other person satisfies what I want or not is the only thing that counts. When I love someone, or when the relationship is more than instrumental, I don't take what I want for granted. I want what I want to change as a result of the other person's wants and desires. And at that point, I put myself at risk. Right? And I want my life to change, precisely. So I agree with you absolutely about that. Wholeheartedly is a nice way of actually of putting it, because it means there are no reservations. You don't hold part of yourself back.
And that's one of the things.
Please.
And that's only possible in some ways as long as it's a possibility, because it seems to me that what basically we project onto that possibility is that it will be our salvation.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's no salvation for us, but as long as we
It,
make
it's,
it a
it,
possibility.
it keeps going. There is no end. It seems to me part of what makes my view, to me, attractive, but also peculiar, is that when the promise is fulfilled, it's over. It's when, one morning you wake up and the poet whom you loved for so long, you read the poem and it has nothing else to give you. When you wake up and the person who's meant everything to you, you have become indifferent to. When you have, as a friend of mine who went through a very painful divorce told me a while ago, said, if I stay with this person, my life, I can see what my life will be like until I die. See? Where you feel, it's not that you have in fact exhausted the other person, because a person can't be exhausted. It's just that you're not interested in finding anything else out. You feel that the effort is not worth it. And the contrary of love for me is, of course, not hate, but indifference. Just as the contrary of beauty is not ugliness, but nondescriptness. It's the things that we don't notice. So, yeah, that's a very good point. Indeed. Thank you. Yes?
So I keep wandering back to Aristotle's taxonomy here.
Sure.
I'm not necessarily sure that I'm 100% convinced that the aesthetic experience demands reciprocity, which I think the act of developing friendship does.
Mm-hmm.
So if I see a Gauguin or listen to Bach, I have that aesthetic experience of doing that, but I don't necessarily expect something in return other than the aesthetic experience in and of itself. Whereas the sort of dance of friendship, you're trying to mediate this space between your subjectivity and the other, and trying to find a place where you can develop that relationship. So I see someone who plays tennis, and he plays tennis very well. And I see him and I say, you have a great tennis game. Let's go play tennis. And I can admire his game, and I can see that he plays tennis beautifully, but it's not necessarily that he plays tennis beautifully, it's that he's playing tennis beautifully with me. And there's that like reciprocity that goes on in navigating that. I could admire Roger Federer and his tennis game, which is the pinnacle of the aesthetic tennis game. But I can reasonably not expect him to go hit around.
To do what?
I wouldn't reasonably expect him to play tennis with me.
That depends on how good a friend you are.
So can you talk a little bit about that, sort of how the sort of dance of friendships work?
Of course, there are differences between the way that we relate to individual people and the way that we relate to works of art. Mary Mothersill, a philosopher who wrote a very interesting book on beauty some years ago, said, yeah, there is a real difference about loving a person and loving a work of art. But the difference is not in the love, it's in the object. In other words, we don't marry works of art. But that's not because we love them in a different way. It's because they're works of art, right? That's why we don't marry them. Now, still, I want to say there is more mutuality and reciprocity than you suggested. Because this forward-looking element that I mentioned before, what does it mean to have have this attitude, and how is it expressed? It's expressed not just by listening to Bach or by looking at Manet's Olympia, which is what I'm obsessed with these days. When I started liking the Olympia, of course, I looked a lot, but I also went out and I learned all kinds of things about Manet and Paris and the nude and this and that and the other, right? In other words, my love for the work changed me in a very serious way. And in the process, since I'm the only person who understands the meaning of that painting today in the world, I have changed it. You see? So it's a bit grandiose what I said, but I mean, there are two other people who agree with me. But this is important to me because I think I allow myself, if you want, my values to change because of my understanding of this painting, right? And in the process, I do something to it so that if my interpretation of it is at all correct, it now has become a slightly different work than it was before. The same way that I expect a person I love or a friend of mine to change as a result of our interaction, the same way that I expect myself to change as a result of it. So there is a sense of reciprocity there too. Though I think you're right, it's very important to distinguish the different species of love. If I love a work of art, I want all my friends to know about it and to admire it. But if I have a lover, I don't particularly want all my friends to become her lover either. And friendship is in between. Yes, Paul.
I was wondering if we could return also just to what your further views are on Aristotle. Do you think then, his classification, seems like you're setting yourself against that, and what's going wrong there? Is Aristotle's moralism blinding him to our ordinary experience? Or it seems like partly what he's trying to do is give us an account of what really makes, what helps explain why we really love something because it's got value, right? The person who's just relating in terms of pleasure or just in terms of advantage, well, we want to say, yeah, there's a resemblance to real love. It's not the real thing. And so it seems like something that follows from his view is something like that. Vicious people really can't have friends. And I wonder if you would want to take...
I don't agree with that, you see. He believes that vicious people don't have a character at all. And he believes that vicious people hate themselves. I don't think that's true. I think mafiosi can be friends, But let me get to the actual issue here, Paul. First of all, I don't think that Aristotle is moralistic. I think the Greek arete, which we translate as virtue, is something much broader, and there I think Hume has a point, because he also thinks of many virtues that we would not think of as, strictly speaking, moral virtues today. Virtue for Aristotle involves outstandingness, excellence among your peers, right? Of course, some of the virtues that Aristotle talks about are or have become moral virtues, but many of them, like magnificence, right, and other things like that, are not. For the Greeks, arete actually is whatever features make an object outstanding within its peers, right? In that sense, I think Aristotle is not moralistic. Where the difference is between my view and Aristotle's view is that Aristotle thinks that we can be friends with somebody only if we appreciate the virtues that this person already has, right? In this broad sense of virtue. I think that the attitude of friendship generates virtues that we observe in the other person. In other words, now generates is the wrong word. Let me put it that way. If I'm a friend of someone, the features that I will cite when I try to explain why I am their friend will be features that I consider virtues in this very broad sense. It's not that they are there already, right, and I appreciate them, which is a very realist view of virtue, and which suggests that the same virtues, more or less, should be appreciated in everyone, right? I'm sorry, you look very puzzled.
Well, I'm just thinking, it starts to sound like Aristotle, on your view, doesn't have room for the deepening of a friendship. I mean, surely it has to be the case that, right? I mean, when he says they have to live together, right, to really, I mean, so there are these features in some sense in us, but we only discover them partly through the deepening of the relationship.
Sure, but the view is that you first realize that the person possesses the virtues, and once you realize that the person possesses the virtues, you become their friend. But the virtues are objective features, even if you know of the person, even if they're not fully realized yet. What I'm suggesting is that what counts as a virtue can differ radically between one person and another. For example, forgetfulness in one friend of mine may be a terrible feature, and I can't stand it, whereas the forgetfulness of this other friend of mine is one of his most charming and lovely features. That's not something that Aristotle can account for.
Why can't you just say that's something you take pleasure in?
Because I think that he is very clear, and I think we have misunderstood him radically. He does not consider these relationships for him are completely instrumental. They are not friendships in any sense of the term.
No, but aren't the people who are friends in terms of virtue, can't they also appreciate their friends in terms of pleasure and advantage?
The virtue friends give both pleasure and profit to each other. But forgetfulness is never something that you can get pleasure in for Aristotle. It doesn't work at all. If you're somebody's friend on account of pleasure, and here again, we're talking about the lunch, we misinterpret him when we use as examples of pleasure friendships, playing tennis. That's a very common example, or somebody who's a witty conversationalist or a drinking partner. Most of his examples of friendships, of pleasure philia, are erotic and mostly pederastic. That's what he is thinking about there. Very, very different situation. And he describes the three kinds of philia in such a way that suggests that they're all the same. But in fact, we could go into it in detail at another time. I don't want to go through the interpretation of the text here. They're fundamentally different. They're instrumental. My view is that a relationship can't be a friendship if it is purely instrumental. There has to be a bit, you have to take the other person or object as an end in itself to some extent. With some people, it's less, with others, it's more. But it has to be there. And those two relationships don't have that. So what I'm saying is that philia, the generic relation philia in Greek, is not friendship. The philia of the virtues is very close to what we consider friendship, with two differences. we have identified virtue today too narrowly with moral virtue, and I want to broaden it, and we are too realist about the existence of those virtues. In other words, they're a set of features that people either have or don't have, and we recognize them, and that makes us friends of the other person, because we recognize, say, the courage or the practical wisdom or something like that. That creates a very serious problem. If I recognize your courage and that makes me your friend, why don't I become your friend if you're equally courageous? If it's a courage that I'm looking at, right? I should be attracted to everyone who's equally courageous, and if I find somebody who's more courageous than you are, I should abandon you and go to them. But we never do that. And I think that's something that Aristotle can't explain. He has only a practical consideration to explain it. He says, life is too short. And, friends need to spend time with each other. You can't do that with many people. So you will ignore the others. I don't think that's what it is. I think the way that we use a word to cover our ignorance here, say, it's not courage that I like, it's your particular way of being courageous, right? Or your particular courage, or your way of being courageous. But that doesn't explain anything. Because to explain the difference between the way that you're courageous and the way you're courageous is to repeat the same problem, to face the same problem again. And I think I can understand that. I think I can explain it. I don't think Aristotle can, except for this practical consideration. And Matt has been trying.
A friendly suggestion.
Friendly suggestion.
Friendly your view. It's, in other words, I don't think that structurally your view is all that much different than Aristotle's, right? Because you think that friends are friends because of their character, right? Because but the thing is that what you're denying is the essentialism about what's a valuable character, right? So for Aristotle, there's a proper way of becoming developing as a human being. There's a relatively narrow range of ways that are appropriate, and so and those are the only things that are lovable by nature are people who developed in those ways. Those are the ones who are lovable by nature. So friends, properly speaking, will only love each other for those reasons, for being developed in that relatively narrow set of ways. So Alexander is denying that essentialism about what it is to live a good human life. Right? Alexander thinks that it's a matter of not so much of what your life is, what you do in your life, but rather the style that you give it, or something like that. And so there's a lot more room for different ways of valuing your friends, but you're still valuing them for their character. And the friendship is progressing roughly along the Aristotelian model. It's just that so for Aristotle, all friendships will look roughly alike, whereas for Nehamas, they're all going to be very, very different. In fact, no friendship will be just like any other.
It's impossible for two friendships to be the same, on my view. So Drake?
Yes. With this question, I may be revealing something about myself that will prove embarrassing. But
it's a clever rhetorical trick. I can't hear you.
When Sean Hannity introduces his radio program, he often says, "This is your friend, Sean Hannity." Now, that introductory quotation raises the issue of the connection between friendship and politics. So I would like to shift the discussion for a moment from Aristotle's ethics to his politics, and to ask you if political choice is an aesthetic or an ethical issue, or neither.
I don't know what to say. Well, I'm very dubious about aestheticizing politics. I mean, there's a danger there. But before we get there, I think that what Hannity does by saying, "This is your friend Sean Hannity," is he makes clear that he's speaking only to a certain segment of the potential audience. In other words, if you don't see yourself as his friend, you don't have to listen to him, so to speak. He establishes partisanship. Now, but there's another problem, though, with ethics, politics and friendship, is that a number of people, including many very interesting feminist philosophers, have offered friendship as an alternative model for organizing political community, which I think is a very moving possibility, but not one that can actually be realized in the long run. precisely because friendship is this differential relationship. If we are friends of each other, we are not friends of those people. Whereas in politics, at least as we are thinking of it today, there is again this notion of egalitarianism that does not sort of involve the kind of invidious distinctions in a way that friendship makes, right? And I don't think that we can, let's put it that way, you couldn't be friends with everyone in the world. The same way that we couldn't all love the same works of art, right? Not only is it impossible, it's not even something that we want. Because if everybody liked the same works of art, we'd be very much alike. It'll be closer to Brave New World than to society today. Now, some people say better Brave New World than what we have today, but I don't. So that's my basic view, that you can't use friendship as a basis for politics. Now, Aristotle famously has several chapters in his chapters on philia, in the books on philia, talking about what we translate as civic friendship. Political philia, he calls it. But for me, political philia is not friendship at all. Because for one thing, he makes it clear it's a species of this advantage, philia. And what it means is that you care in some broad sense about people who live within the same walls, right? In other words, their interests are in some way your interest as well, because you can help each other in certain ways. But that has nothing to do with friendship as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's a big mistake to try to think of Aristotle believing that the city is organized on the basis of friendship. Because philia, as I put it, is, for Aristotle, is his generic concept for interpersonal interaction. Whereas the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics is all about how an individual soul can prepare itself to become virtuous. The two books on philia have to do with what a person does with other people, whereas the rest of the books is only about the inner structure of the individual. So philia is the generic concept. Virtue philia is close to what we call friendship today, but with the differences that I think Matt explained as well as I possibly could. Yeah.
I'm interested in how you think about admiration. You working with the very narrow conception of morality, the morality system. Right. You talked about respect being the kind of form of response that would be proper to that, admiration to the non-moral or the aesthetic. I mean, it strikes me that even, given the narrow conception of morality, we do speak, and I think actually experience admiration. You hear about people who did, there's great acts of bravery, and you feel admiration for that. And something like, I mean, the idea of to kalon figures here. It seems beautiful even. I mean, you admire it. And it doesn't seem out of place to me to say some of these acts, of whatever you like, that, sort of overused example, but sheltering Jews, during World War II, beautiful, certainly admirable. I just want to know if you have if anything is at stake for you in denying that and saying,
No, I don't think so. I mean, I hope not, anyway. There is a common ground between admiration in the non-moral sort of area and this, namely that these acts that we admire within the moral context are all acts of serious supererogation. In other words, once again, they are the acts of people who stand out among their peers. So that, within the morality system, these people do something that distinguishes them from the rest. And doesn't mean that the others are immoral, right? But they do something much, much higher. And in doing so, they show us the possibility of doing things differently from what we've done, but they don't, unlike the sort of ground level morality, we don't have an obligation to act like them. That's a big difference, right? That's the difference between admiration and respect. That in admiration, we feel, and there should be, no sense that we are obliged to act like them at all. We might want to act like them, but that's very different.
Is it for you an intrinsic part of admiration that you do want to act like that or
Yeah.
be like that
Yeah.
thing that you admire?
Yeah.
Is that a-
Absolutely. But there's a rider to this, namely that in most cases where I admire someone, what I want to accomplish, when I say I want to be like that, I don't want to perform the same actions. Let me give you another aesthetic example. You want to find out how to paint great paintings, and I'm a teacher of art. And you come to me, and I take a Rembrandt self-portrait, and I say, that's how you paint a great work of art. Now, what are you going to do? If you copy it, you failed. So you go away, you work hard, you learn about painting, and if you're very good and very lucky and very hardworking, someday you come back with a very different painting that is as great maybe as the Rembrandt, but it's only by being different that it manages to imitate the quality of the Rembrandt. It's the Nietzsche thing that I was given before. I want everybody to make their own example as I do. But to do that, they have to do something fundamentally different from me. And now, sometimes, of course, you say, I wish I could act like that. Yeah. But
I
ultimately...
wish I could act like
That's right.
that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
You know.
Right.
Good.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'd like to follow up a question that Professor Drake asked you.
About politics.
Considered to be an example of political philosophy. Some philosophers in the past, you might be called political philosophers, felt that philosophy must engage with the world.
Yes.
And I hope there's still some of those left in the present time, too. I don't get the impression from your talk.
Well, no. I mean, you know, I exaggerated for political reasons.
The other questioners that this is important. And I'd like your take on this in view of the importance of some of the issues that affect our species as a whole and the history of our planet. And yet most of the discussion here has been on a very personal, introspective, subjective level.
Yes, certainly.
And I'd like to know what's happened to political philosophy.
Oh, political philosophy is alive and well and doesn't need my help. No. You see, my point is that we have overlooked incredibly this, what you call this personal side of life. That our interest has been in the more public and abstract issues. Now, there may be a separate issue whether the way that we deal with political philosophy today is relevant to political reality. That's a separate issue. But what interests me is the fact that we have moved away from the Socratic ideal, the Socratic purpose, namely to seriously think about how to live our life and to think that philosophy has something to show us about that. Now you could say, well, you know, politics is more important. I'll say, yeah, well, it's important too, but, you know, one can't do everything, right?
Well, I think they're integrated, actually, the personal and the political. And the
Of course they are.
mass are integrated.
Sure.
I think our legal system demonstrates that we are concerned about questions of personal privacy and free speech, for example.
But that has nothing to do with the philosophical issue. Of course we're concerned, I mean, a legal system protects the individual and so on and so forth, but that doesn't mean that philosophy has asked the right questions about what it is to live a good life. I think it's not that we haven't asked them at all. I think when we ask the question, we try to answer it in terms of purely moral and political considerations. And I want to say there's a whole other range of considerations that we need to pay attention to. And once again, I think there are philosophers, Hume is one of them, and Spinoza is another, who have lots of things to say about that. But we don't read them as much for that aspect of their work. We read Hume because of, you know, his views on causation, or his empiricism, or his epistemology, or whatever. Second book and the rest of the treatise, you know, I mean, if we have time, we'll get to it, you know, and the rest in the end of the semester. Yeah.
Are you doing it in a way that can reach out beyond people who have a deep knowledge of formal philosophy.
Well,
You know,
what
that's,
can I say? How did you find it?
well,
Are you
giving
uninterested?
a public speech tonight, so I suppose you probably have to deal with that.
No, I mean, you're asking me whether people without a formal training in philosophy can get involved in those questions. And I'm asking you on the assumption that you're not a professional philosopher.
That's true.
Did you find what I said engaging? I mean, you may not have. You can say me. You can say that. It won't hurt me all that much.
Well, I'm not a typical example of, the ordinary citizen.
Well, the ordinary
I've had an academic background in science, and I've read political philosophers
Right.
sometimes.
So whom do you want me to address? Who do you think is the right audience for me to address?
The general public.
The general public. I mean, the people who don't read?
Those are very important questions you raise.
Yeah, but I mean, no, seriously, I mean, I'm not joking now. It's not always easy to address the general public, right? I mean, the general public is a very inchoate notion. I mean, the general public involves, people who don't speak English, and people who don't read, and people whose politics is totally different from mine, and all that. Plato has already sort of been there, done that in a sense, when he says that, there's a difference between philosophy and rhetoric. And
I wish we had more time.
I'd like to be rhetorically unchallenged, but I'm not.
Thank you, Professor Nahas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good.